The party was meant to be a celebration, the kind people talked about for weeks. It was held in a large rented hall with shiny floors, tall lights, and soft music playing in the background. Tables were covered with white cloths, flowers were placed carefully in the center, and waiters moved around with trays of food and drinks. Everything looked perfect on the outside. She had planned it all herself. From the guest list to the decorations, she wanted everyone to see how well she lived, how high she had risen. She walked through the hall with confidence, greeting guests with a bright smile, laughing loudly, and making sure all eyes were on her. People admired her clothes, her confidence, and the way she carried herself. She enjoyed that feeling more than anything. To her, this party was not just a gathering, it was proof. Proof that she belonged among important people. Proof that she was better than where she came from. Proof that her life was something others should envy. Her husband stayed close, smiling quietly, shaking hands, and answering questions. He was used to this side of her. At home, she was controlling and sharp-tongued, but in public, she wore charm like a mask. He did not argue. He rarely did. The guests were mostly friends, business contacts, and distant relatives. Everyone spoke politely, complimenting the food and the venue. The atmosphere was light, but under the surface, there was tension. Not everyone felt comfortable, though few could explain why. Then, a little later than expected, an elderly woman entered the hall. She walked slowly, holding her small handbag close to her body. Her clothes were clean but old-fashioned. The colors were dull compared to the bright outfits around her. Shoes made a soft sound against the floor as she stepped inside, unsure where to go. She paused near the entrance, looking around. The noise, the lights, and the crowd overwhelmed her for a moment. She took a deep breath and continued forward, scanning faces she barely recognized. This was her first time at such a grand event. She was the mother of the host's husband. When the host saw her, her smile tightened. For a brief second, her eyes showed irritation before she quickly hid it. She excused herself from a group and walked toward the older woman with quick steps. "What are you wearing?" she asked in a low but sharp voice. The older woman blinked, confused. "I thought it was nice," she replied softly. "I ironed it myself." The host looked her up and down, clearly unhappy. "You could have at least tried to look decent. People are staring." No one was staring, but the words still landed like a slap. The elderly woman lowered her eyes. "I didn't want to be late," she said. "The bus was crowded." The host let out a short laugh. Of course it was. She did not offer her arm. She did not guide her to a table. Instead, she walked ahead, expecting the older woman to follow. They passed groups of guests who watched quietly, sensing something uncomfortable, but choosing to stay silent. She led her to a small chair near the side of the hall, close to the kitchen door. "You can sit here," she said. "Don't wander around, and please don't bother the guests with stories. This isn't the place." The elderly woman nodded slowly and sat down. She folded her hands in her lap, her shoulders slightly hunched. A waiter passed by and asked if she wanted something to drink. Before she could answer, the host stepped in. "She doesn't need anything," she said quickly. "She'll manage." The waiter hesitated, then walked away. From across the room, the husband noticed. He watched his mother sitting alone, away from the others. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. He told himself it was just for a while. He told himself not to cause a scene. The music grew louder. People laughed. Glasses clinked. The elderly woman sat quietly, watching everyone else enjoy themselves. She smiled now and then, not because she was happy, but because she did not want to look out of place. When it was time to serve food, the host made sure her mother-in-law was served last. By the time a plate reached her, most of the food was cold. She did not complain. She ate slowly, carefully, as if afraid of spilling something. A few guests noticed and exchanged looks. One woman whispered to another, shaking her head slightly. But no one stood up. No one said a word. At one point, the elderly woman stood up and tried to walk toward her son. She wanted to ask how he was doing. She had not seen him properly in months. Before she could reach him, the host noticed and rushed over. "Where do you think you're going?" she asked sharply. I just wanted to speak to him, the older woman said. Not now, the host replied. You'll embarrass him. Go back and sit. Her voice was not loud, but it was firm enough for those nearby to hear. The older woman froze, then turned back without another word. She returned to her chair, her face burning. The party continued. Speeches were made. The host took the microphone and spoke proudly about success, growth, and the future. She thanked her friends for supporting her and praised herself for organizing such a beautiful event. She did not mention family. From her seat near the kitchen, the elderly woman listened. Her eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away. She reminded herself why she was there. She reminded herself that she had endured worse. She remembered. Years ago, living in a small house, working long hours, saving every little amount she could. She remembered choosing her son's needs over her own again and again. She remembered believing that kindness would one day come back to her. She reached into her handbag and touched a thick envelope hidden inside. She did not open it. The host passed by again and noticed the gesture. What are you hiding? She asked, half joking, half suspicious. Nothing, the elderly woman replied calmly. Good, the host said, because I don't want any drama today. Drama, she thought, was something other people caused, not her. As the night went on, the elderly woman grew tired. Her back ached, her feet hurt. Still, she stayed. She stayed because she believed leaving early would be seen as rude. When guests began to leave, they shook the host's hand and praised her once more. Some glanced at the elderly woman, offering small, polite smiles. She returned them gently. Finally, the hall began to empty. The host walked over, arms crossed. You can go now, she said. We'll talk later. The elderly woman stood up slowly. She looked around the hall one last time, not with anger, not with jealousy, but with understanding. She nodded and walked toward the exit on her own. Outside, the night air was cool and quiet. She waited for the bus, holding her handbag close, the envelope still inside. Inside the hall, the host laughed with relief, believing the night had gone exactly as planned. She did not know that this was only the beginning. Days passed after the party, but the memory of that night lingered in the elderly woman's mind. She remembered the laughter, the clinking glasses, and most of all, the sharp words. But she did not dwell on the humiliation. Instead, she thought quietly about the years behind her, the choices she had made, and the life she had led. She had always been careful. Even when life seemed unfair, she planned her steps, thinking about the long term. She knew that appearances often misled people. She had learned to keep secrets, to hide the strength that lived quietly in her heart. Most people assumed she was weak because she never raised her voice. They never guessed how much power she really held. Her past was a mixture of struggles and small victories. When her son was a child, she had worked multiple jobs to make sure he had what he needed. She had sacrificed her comfort, her own dreams, and sometimes even her health, so he could grow with opportunities she never had. She had endured criticism from relatives, whispers in the neighborhood, and even the judgment of strangers. But she had never complained. She believed that one day her patience and sacrifices would matter. She remembered the envelope in her handbag. It was not just paper. It was her insurance, her careful planning, and her way to ensure that her actions mattered when the time was right. It contained documents, instructions, and plans that could change the course of the family's future. For years, she had worked quietly behind the scenes, observing, learning, and preparing. She had never shared her knowledge with anyone, not even her son. He knew her as a gentle, quiet woman who sometimes seemed old-fashioned and overly careful. But he did not know the sharp mind she hid beneath her calm exterior. She had never wanted attention or control. She had only wanted fairness and respect. As the days went on, she noticed small things that reinforced her understanding. Her daughter-in-law continued her pattern of behavior, bragging in public, criticizing people quietly, and believing that appearances were everything. She had no idea that her words and actions could have consequences she did not see. She assumed the world revolved around her charm and wealth. She assumed she was untouchable. The elderly woman smiled quietly to herself. She understood that sometimes People believed they were in charge when they were only part of a bigger story. And she had learned to be patient. She had learned that the world has a way of balancing things out if one is prepared. She spent her days calmly observing the family. She watched her son at work, his careful way of handling business, and the way he trusted his wife's judgment. She noticed how quickly decisions were made under her daughter-in-law's influence, sometimes without thought for the consequences. Yet her son remained unaware of the depth of his mother's quiet power. During this time, she also began to meet with her trusted advisors. People she had known for years, people who respected her wisdom, came to her for guidance. They did not see her as a woman who had been slighted or humiliated at a party. They saw her as someone who had been strategic, careful, and patient for decades. Together, they reviewed documents, discussed options, and made plans to ensure that her years of work would not go unnoticed. One afternoon, she received a call from a lawyer she trusted. He spoke softly but with urgency, explaining that certain actions needed to be taken soon. She listened carefully, asking questions, confirming details, and ensuring that every step was measured. She was careful not to act hastily, understanding that patience and precision were crucial. Meanwhile, the daughter-in-law continued her usual routines. She called friends to talk about the party, laughed about minor incidents, and showed off her gifts and successes. She had no idea that beneath the surface, serious changes were in motion. She thought the world was hers to control. The elderly woman often thought back to the day she arrived at the party. She remembered the sharp glance, the critical words, and the way she was led to a chair as if she were nothing more than an inconvenience. But she also remembered how she had stayed calm, held her head high, and quietly kept her own plans close. That calmness had allowed her to maintain control when others had thought she had none. Her son noticed her composure during these days. He observed how she carried herself, the quiet confidence in her actions, and the way she managed tasks that seemed simple but required deep knowledge. He began to see her in a different light, realizing that she was not just his mother, but someone who had quietly shaped much of what he had achieved. One evening, she sat by the window in her small but tidy home, looking at the city lights in the distance. She thought about her life, the choices she had made, and the people who had underestimated her. She felt no bitterness, only calm determination. She knew that everything she had prepared would soon be revealed. And when that happened, the world would see her not as weak or old-fashioned, but as someone who had quietly guided the course of events. The envelope in her handbag remained unopened for now. It was her silent power, a reminder that patience was more effective than anger. She had seen many people make mistakes by acting too quickly, letting pride and emotions dictate their actions. She had learned that the true strength was in waiting, observing, and acting at the right moment. As days turned into weeks, small signs began to appear that her plans were taking shape. Notices arrived, business affairs shifted, and trusted allies began to follow her guidance without realizing it. Everything moved quietly, almost invisibly. But she knew that the consequences were building. She remained calm, continuing her daily routines, showing care to her son and family, but always keeping one step ahead. She was careful to avoid confrontation, knowing that sudden actions could backfire. Instead, she let the world reveal itself slowly, letting her preparations unfold like a quiet wave. Her daughter-in-law, meanwhile, continued in her bubble of self-assurance. She still spoke sharply, laughed loudly, and believed that control was hers alone. She never suspected that the woman she had mocked and treated unfairly was quietly setting the stage for change. Her actions at the party, which had seemed unimportant, would soon meet consequences she could not imagine. And the elderly woman, watching quietly from her seat, from her home, and through careful planning, understood that this was not about revenge. It was about balance, about fairness, and about the recognition of the work and patience she had invested over decades. She did not need to shout or demand respect. She only needed to act wisely, and the results would speak for themselves. Every morning, she rose with a sense of purpose. She reviewed her plans, checked details, and made small adjustments. She spoke to trusted allies, always careful to maintain discretion. She understood the value of timing, knowing that patience would turn the tide in her favor without unnecessary conflict. Her son began to notice subtle changes. Decisions he had once made quickly were now influenced by his mother's quiet advice. Business matters that seemed stalled were moving again. And though he did not fully understand, he began to see the depth of her insight. He realized that she had always been more than she appeared. Her calm demeanor had hidden immense knowledge and wisdom. The daughter-in-law remained oblivious. She continued her public displays of control, her sharp comments, and her disregard for the quiet strength of others. She assumed the world would always respond to her charm and boldness. She did not know that the quiet, patient force she had underestimated was already reshaping the future. The elderly woman smiled to herself, thinking about the lessons life had taught her. Respect, patience, and careful observation were more powerful than anger or pride. She had learned that those who act quickly without thought often stumble, while those who wait, observe, and plan carefully succeed quietly, but surely. And so she continued, day by day, step by step, preparing for the moment when her plans would be revealed. The envelope remained safely tucked away, a symbol of her patience and quiet strength. She knew that when the time came, the world would see her not as someone to be mocked or dismissed, but as a woman whose wisdom and foresight could not be ignored. For now, she remained calm, focused, and confident. She moved through her days with quiet dignity, aware that fate was already at work, shaping events in ways that the daughter-in-law could never anticipate. The story was far from over, and the stage was set for a turning point that would change everything. The woman who had been treated unfairly at the party had the power to shift the balance, and she was ready, patient, and prepared for the moment when the world would finally recognize her quiet strength. Weeks turned into months, and the quiet life of the elderly woman continued much as before. Though everything around her was beginning to shift in subtle, almost invisible ways, she moved with the same calmness and dignity, observing quietly while carefully planning the next steps. Every detail mattered. Every conversation she had was noted, and every opportunity was considered. She had learned that patience and observation often carried more weight than loud words or public actions. The daughter-in-law remained wrapped up in her own world, unaware that the tide was slowly turning. She continued her daily routines, attending social events, meeting friends, and boasting about her achievements. She believed she controlled everything within the household and beyond. She laughed at minor misfortunes and mocked small mistakes, never suspecting that the woman she had humiliated months earlier was quietly building influence that could not be ignored. The elderly woman met regularly with her trusted advisors, people who had known her for years and had great respect for her wisdom. They worked quietly, reviewing documents, business plans, and family matters that were critical to the family's future. She had always trusted a small circle of people who understood her integrity, knowledge, and strategic thinking. Together, they discussed options, prepared for potential outcomes, and ensured that every action would be precise, leaving no room for error. She also spent time studying the family's current dynamics, learning about financial decisions, legal obligations, and personal relationships. Her observations were careful, quiet, and deliberate. She did not interfere overtly, but she made mental notes about the decisions that had been made, the directions the family business had taken, and the ways her son had been influenced by his wife. She noticed how some friends and business partners had started making choices without consulting her son, thinking they were taking advantage of opportunities in the absence of her guidance. It was subtle, but she recognized the risk and began quietly reclaiming influence. Every evening, she would sit by the window in her modest home, looking out at the quiet streets and city lights. She thought about the party, the words that had stung her, and the reaction of her daughter-in-law. She did not dwell on bitterness, but she allowed herself to reflect on how little people understood. It's a quiet strength it takes to endure humiliation with dignity. The envelope in her handbag remained a constant companion, its contents a symbol of her careful planning and patient approach. She knew that the time to reveal it had not yet arrived. Every action needed perfect timing. Meanwhile, her son began to notice small changes. He found that certain business matters, previously stalled, were suddenly moving forward with more efficiency. Decisions seemed clearer, processes smoother, and people he had relied on were starting to act with greater integrity. He wondered how this change had come about. It slowly began to dawn on him that his mother had been quietly influencing events all along. He admired her more deeply than he had before. Seeing the wisdom and foresight that had guided her every step, the daughter-in-law, oblivious to these developments, continued to focus on appearances. She would often hold small gatherings, ensuring that she remained at the center of attention. She spoke of her successes, mocked minor mistakes, and subtly reminded people of her wealth and status. She believed that power came from visibility and charm, but she did not understand that true power could operate silently, shaping events in ways that were not immediately visible. The elderly woman observed this behavior with calm amusement. She understood the dangers of overconfidence and pride. She remembered her own youth and the lessons life had taught her. Humility, patience, and careful planning often outweighed forcefulness and arrogance. She knew that the daughter-in-law's confidence was temporary, and that her disregard for subtle consequences could create openings for change. Her strategic thinking was matched by her attention to detail. She reviewed legal documents related to property, family wealth, and business dealings. She consulted with lawyers and advisors to ensure that every step was legally sound, ethically correct, and likely to have the intended effect. She never acted impulsively or out of anger. Every action was deliberate, measured, aimed at ensuring fairness and justice. One afternoon, she decided to visit an old family property. It had been in the family for decades, and she remembered how much effort she had put into maintaining it over the years. She walked through the rooms, touching familiar surfaces, remembering old memories, and quietly assessing its current condition. She saw the potential for improvement, not just physically, but also in terms of its value and role within the family. It was another opportunity to prepare for a future moment, an investment in careful planning that would eventually benefit those she cared about. During these months, the daughter-in-law began to notice minor inconveniences and unexpected changes. Business contacts she relied on started asking questions about decisions she had made. Certain accounts appeared to be restricted, and some allies seemed distant. She was puzzled, unable to understand why her influence was not producing the expected results. She blamed external circumstances, not realizing that the quiet power she had dismissed months ago was quietly reshaping everything. The elderly woman never acted openly. She never sought revenge. She did not gloat or make threats. Instead, she focused on precision, timing, and strategy. She knew that patience and subtlety were far more powerful than confrontation or anger. Her goal was not to humiliate, to correct the balance, ensure that respect and fairness were restored. Her son continued to notice her quiet influence. He began to consult her more often, valuing her insight and guidance. He realized that her perspective had always been grounded in experience, patience, and wisdom. He appreciated that she had never acted for personal gain, but always with the family's well-being in mind. Slowly, he started to see the truth about the daughter-in-law's behavior and the contrast between her public charm and private cruelty. The daughter-in-law, meanwhile, remained oblivious. She continued to display confidence and pride, unaware that the foundations of her control were beginning to shift. Every careless remark, every act of disregard, and every assumption of superiority were noted, remembered, and prepared for by the woman she had treated unfairly. Evenings became moments of reflection for the elderly woman. She thought about the family's past, the sacrifices she had made, and the lessons life had taught her. She reminded herself that patience was strength, and quiet observation was often the key to understanding. She reviewed plans, checked details, and ensured that every action would lead to meaningful results. She was not impatient. She was confident that time would reveal the truth and that justice could be achieved without conflict. Gradually, small victories appeared. People who had been influenced by her advice began to act more wisely. Businesses ran more smoothly, and trust returned to relationships that had been strained. These changes were subtle, almost invisible, but they built momentum. The elderly woman understood that true change often worked this way, slowly, quietly, and steadily, until the effect became undeniable. The daughter-in-law continued to live in her bubble of self-assurance, unaware that the seemingly powerless woman she had humiliated was quietly reclaiming influence. She assumed that appearances and charm were all that mattered, failing to recognize the depth of strategy and planning that had been quietly underway for months. One day, a trusted advisor called the elderly woman with urgent news. Certain legal documents and family matters required immediate attention. She listened carefully, considered every option, and responded with calm precision. Every step she took was calculated to ensure the desired outcome. Her years of patience and planning were beginning to bear fruit, and she knew that the moment of change was approaching. Her son noticed that certain decisions now reflected her wisdom. He realized that his mother had always been more capable than he had understood. He began to rely on her advice more openly, appreciating her insight and careful judgment. Slowly, the dynamic in the household began to shift. The daughter-in-law's unchecked confidence was starting to meet quiet resistance, not through confrontation, but through careful planning and influence. The elderly woman smiled quietly, knowing that the stage was set for a turning point. She did not need to rush. She did not need to act dramatically. Everything she had prepared, every careful observation, every patient step, was leading toward a moment when the truth would emerge. The envelope in her handbag remained a symbol of her patience, quiet power that had waited for the right time. She continued her days with the same calm determination, observing, planning, and preparing. She knew that the consequences of actions taken months ago were beginning to unfold, that small shifts in decisions and behavior were building momentum, and that the daughter-in-law's confidence was no longer unchallenged. The quiet strength of patience, observation, and careful action was now in motion, and the stage was set for a revelation that would change everything. The household began to feel a subtle shift, though no one except the elderly woman noticed it fully. Things that once ran smoothly under the daughter-in-law's influence started to encounter delays. Small mistakes appeared, and people who had once followed her lead began questioning decisions. The daughter-in-law could not understand why things were not working as she expected. She assumed it was coincidence, bad luck, or external circumstances. She had no idea that the quiet force she had mocked months ago was now guiding events in ways she could not see. The elderly woman remained calm as ever. She continued to meet with her trusted advisors, reviewing documents and checking every detail. She made sure each action she planned was careful, precise, and aligned with the long-term outcome she desired. She never acted out of anger or pride. Her actions were measured, deliberate, and aimed at restoring balance. She understood that true power was exercised quietly, not through shouting or confrontation. Meanwhile, the daughter-in-law's arrogance continued to grow. She hosted small social gatherings, bragged about her successes, and made subtle digs at those she thought were beneath her. Her laughter was loud, her presence commanding, and her words often cutting. Yet, beneath all of that, there was an undercurrent of uncertainty she could not quite place. Something felt different, though she could not identify what it was. The elderly woman observed this change quietly. She knew that overconfidence could lead people to make mistakes. She had learned in her life that pride often blinds judgment. The daughter-in-law's belief that she controlled everything left openings that the woman had been preparing for years to take advantage of. Patience had been her greatest ally, and now she could see the results of that patience starting to appear. Her son began to notice the subtle shifts in behavior and decision-making. He observed that certain business contacts were more careful, more honest, and more willing to consider his mother's advice. Small errors that had caused concern for months suddenly corrected themselves, and solutions appeared almost effortlessly. He realized that his mother's influence was quietly but profoundly shaping events. He admired her more deeply than ever before, realizing that her calm, measured approach had always been her strength. The daughter-in-law began to experience minor frustrations that slowly accumulated into serious concern. Plans that she had assumed were secure were now in question. Certain allies she thought loyal began to show independence, making decisions she could not predict. She tried to maintain control, but every effort seemed to meet subtle resistance. Her confidence started to waver, though she would never admit it out loud. The elderly woman however, remained focused on her long-term plan. She did not rush or act impulsively. She knew that timing was everything. Her careful observation, patient guidance, and strategic planning had put her in a position where she could influence outcomes without force or confrontation. She knew that actions taken too soon or too aggressively could backfire, so she waited, letting events unfold naturally while staying one step ahead. One day, she visited another family property, a small building that had been part of the family for decades. She walked through the rooms, taking notes, remembering old times, and assessing the current state. She saw potential not only in improving its value, but also in using it as part of her plan to restore balance within the family. Every detail mattered, from the layout of the rooms to the way the surrounding neighborhood was changing. She noted everything carefully, knowing that her preparation would eventually influence important decisions. She also began reaching out discreetly to individuals who had been overlooked or ignored by the daughter-in-law. People who had once felt powerless were now being consulted for advice and included in decision-making. Slowly but surely, loyalty and respect began to shift toward the elderly woman. She did not boast or demand recognition. Her actions spoke for themselves. People were drawn to her calm wisdom and thoughtful guidance. Often without realizing why, the daughter-in-law, meanwhile, grew increasingly frustrated. She noticed that some of her influence was slipping, though she could not pinpoint the cause. Her carefully crafted plans began to unravel subtly, and the people she had relied on were no longer responding as expected. Attempts to regain control were met with polite resistance or careful corrections. She was confused and irritated. Unable to see the quiet power operating behind the scenes, the elderly woman continued to observe, plan, and act with precision. Every conversation she had, every decision she guided, and every interaction she participated in was part of a carefully constructed strategy. She knew that the daughter-in-law's arrogance and overconfidence would eventually lead to mistakes. She also knew that patience and careful planning could create opportunities without confrontation. Her son began to recognize the contrast between his mother's quiet strength and his wife's overconfidence. He noticed how smoothly things worked when his mother's advice was followed, and how chaos appeared when the daughter-in-law acted alone. Slowly, he began to see the importance of wisdom, experience, and patience over charm, pride, and outward appearances. He started consulting his mother more openly, valuing her insight and judgment. The daughter-in-law, meanwhile, was unaware that the foundation of her influence had already begun to shift. She continued to focus on appearances, public approval, and immediate gratification. She assumed that charm, wealth, and visibility were enough to maintain control. She did not realize that her ignorance of the elderly woman's quiet planning was slowly eroding her position. Evenings became moments of reflection and planning for the elderly woman. She reviewed every detail, considered all possible outcomes, and prepared for the right moment to reveal her influence. She never acted hastily, understanding that the correct timing would make her actions far more effective. Patience, observation, and careful preparation had always been her strategy. And now the results were beginning to emerge. Small signs of success became more apparent over time. People who had been influenced by her guidance acted wisely. Decisions that had been stalled now moved forward, and trust returned to relationships that had been strained. These victories were quiet, almost invisible to the untrained eye, but they built momentum. The elderly woman understood that true change often works this way, subtly and steadily, until the effect becomes undeniable. The daughter-in-law, oblivious to the gradual changes, continued her displays of confidence and control. Her loud laughter, sharp remarks, and public charm masked her growing frustration and inability to maintain her previous influence. Every careless remark and display of arrogance was quietly noted, remembered, and considered in the elderly woman's planning. One afternoon, the elderly woman received an important call from her lawyer. Certain legal matters required immediate attention, and her input was critical. She handled the situation calmly, carefully guiding the next steps to ensure the desired outcome. Every decision was deliberate, every action precise, and every step aligned with her long-term strategy. She did not need to confront anyone. Her careful preparation allowed events to unfold in her favor naturally. Her son noticed the subtle but powerful changes. He began to rely on his mother's guidance more openly, seeking her advice on important matters. He realized that her patience, careful observation, and strategic thinking had always been her greatest strength. Slowly, the family dynamic began to shift. The daughter-in-law's unchecked confidence was now meeting quiet, strategic resistance. The elderly woman smiled quietly, knowing that the stage was set for a major turning point. She did not need to act hastily or aggressively. The time for confrontation had not yet come. She understood that the right moment would reveal itself, and when it did, the results would speak for themselves. The envelope in her handbag remained a symbol of her quiet power and patient planning. Every day, she continued to observe, plan, and guide events with subtle precision. She knew that the consequences of actions taken months ago were now unfolding, that small shifts in behavior and decision-making were creating momentum, and that the daughter-in-law's confidence was no longer unchallenged. The quiet strength of patience, careful observation, and thoughtful action was now in motion, and the stage was ready for a revelation that would change everything. Months had passed since the party, and the household had transformed quietly but significantly. The daughter-in-law, who once believed she controlled every detail, began to notice that her influence was slipping. Small things that had always gone her way no longer did. Staff members asked her questions she could not answer. Decisions she assumed were final were being reconsidered. In certain business dealings she thought secure suddenly appeared uncertain. Confusion and frustration began to creep into her confidence. The elderly woman observed these changes with calm satisfaction. She had never sought revenge or public humiliation. Her goal had always been fairness and balance. She had worked patiently, quietly guiding events, ensuring that her influence grew without anyone realizing it. She had used wisdom, timing, and careful preparation to regain respect and authority, all without confrontation. Her son began to see the contrast more clearly. He noticed how smoothly matters were handled when his mother was involved, and how disruptions occurred when his wife acted alone. Slowly, he began to rely on his mother's judgment openly, seeking her advice on important matters. He realized that her quiet strength had always been the true foundation of the family's stability. Respect replaced assumptions, and admiration replaced casual oversight. The daughter-in-law, oblivious to the full extent of what was happening, became increasingly anxious. She tried to assert control, but subtle resistance emerged at every turn. Staff members who once followed her directions without question now hesitated or offered alternative suggestions. Business associates, who had been easily influenced, began acting independently. Her charm and outward confidence no longer guaranteed compliance. For the first time, she felt uncertainty and the uncomfortable awareness that she had been underestimating the quiet strength she had mocked. The elderly woman continued her careful guidance. She met with advisors, checked documents, and monitored the progress of her carefully orchestrated plans. Every action she took was deliberate, ensuring that fairness was restored without creating conflict. She understood the importance of timing and patience. Her quiet authority, once invisible, was now unmistakable, yet she acted with grace, never needing to raise her voice or make threats. One day she decided it was time to take a more direct step. She called a family meeting, inviting her son and daughter-in-law to discuss certain decisions and future plans. She approached the meeting with calm confidence, her presence commanding attention without effort. Her son sensed the significance of the meeting, while the daughter-in-law assumed it would be another routine discussion, unaware of the subtle shift in authority. As the meeting began, the elderly woman spoke gently but firmly. She reviewed important matters, pointing out inconsistencies and gaps in planning that had gone unnoticed. She highlighted areas where decisions could be improved and suggested solutions that were both practical and fair. Her advice was precise, informed, and clearly rooted in long-term understanding. Every word carried weight, and every suggestion was considered carefully by her son.